The chandelier light fractured across the polished marble floor like 1,000 silent witnesses, each reflection catching a different version of the truth no one was ready to face. The music swelled, a soft orchestral rise that wrapped itself around the towering white columns and drifting silk arrangements, and every guest in the room leaned subtly forward, drawn into the quiet gravity of a wedding designed to be unforgettable. Cameras hovered in discreet hands, phones angled just enough to capture elegance without seeming intrusive, while waitstaff moved like shadows along the edges of the room, balancing silver trays that glinted under the warm gold light. At the far end of the aisle, beneath an arch of white roses and cascading greenery, the officiant stood poised, calm, as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. But nothing in this room had prepared for what was about to unfold. Ethan Caldwell entered without announcement, yet his presence rippled through the crowd with the weight of recognition alone. Conversations softened, then stilled. Heads turned in a subtle chain reaction, one after another, until the entire room seemed to orbit his arrival. He didn't rush. He never did. His tailored black suit carried the quiet authority of a man who owned buildings that scraped the skyline, whose decisions moved markets before breakfast. The polished leather of his shoes echoed faintly against the marble, each step measured, controlled, deliberate. He wasn't here to be seen, but visibility followed him like a shadow that refused to break. A few guests exchanged glances, whispers forming behind careful smiles. Why is he here? Who invited him? Ethan's expression didn't shift. It rarely did. His jaw was set, his gaze forward, scanning the room not for faces, but for exits, angles, control. Weddings were not his world. He understood contracts, acquisitions, risk. Not vows. Not promises made in front of 100 witnesses and sealed with applause. Still, he had come. Because the invitation had been impossible to ignore. Because the name printed on it had unsettled something he thought he had buried years ago. Because curiosity, sharp and unwelcome, had followed him all the way into this room. He took a seat near the back, far enough to observe without being drawn into conversation. The music shifted, softer now, signaling the approach of the moment everyone had been waiting for. The bridesmaids began their walk, dresses flowing in coordinated grace, bouquets held with practiced ease. The audience responded exactly as expected, smiles, soft applause, a few quiet murmurs about beauty and timing and perfection. Ethan barely noticed. His attention had narrowed, not by choice, but by instinct, as if something in the air had shifted direction and pulled him with it. Then the doors opened. A collective breath moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Every camera tilted forward. Every eye lifted. The bride stepped into view, framed by light that seemed almost intentional in its precision, catching the edges of her silhouette before revealing her fully. For a fraction of a second, she was only form and motion, white fabric, slow steps, the gentle sway of something designed to be admired. Then she lifted her face, and the entire world stopped. Ethan didn't blink. He couldn't. The sound in the room, music, whispers, movement, collapsed into a distant hum that no longer belonged to him. His chest tightened, not sharply, but steadily, like pressure building behind something that had been sealed too long. Amara Collins. The name didn't echo. It landed. Heavy. Final. Unavoidable. She hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. Time had refined her, sharpened the quiet confidence in her posture, deepened the stillness in her eyes. But it was her. There was no mistaking that. The same woman he had once walked away from without looking back now stood at the center of a room built for celebration. Every step she took drawing her closer to a future that did not include him. His fingers curled slightly against his knee, the only visible fracture in his composure. Around him, the audience leaned into the moment, captivated by the elegance, the emotion, the story they believed they were witnessing. No one else saw what he saw. No one else felt the sudden shift in gravity, the way the past had stepped into the present without permission and taken control of the room. Amara's gaze remained forward, fixed on the aisle ahead, on the man waiting for her beneath the arch. She didn't hesitate. Not once. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, in the subtle tightening of her grip around the bouquet, that spoke to a discipline far deeper than nerves. This wasn't just a walk toward marriage. This was a walk through memory. Halfway down the aisle, she looked up, And for the first time, her eyes found his. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no stumble, no break in rhythm. Just a moment. A single, precise moment where recognition passed between them like a quiet current, unseen but undeniable. Ethan felt it hit before he could process it. Not anger, not regret. Something colder, something heavier. Awareness. She didn't stop. She didn't falter. Her gaze held his for exactly as long as it needed to. Long enough to acknowledge, long enough to confirm, long enough to make it clear that nothing about this moment was accidental. Then she looked away, and in that simple motion, she erased him from the center of the story he had just stepped into. The music swelled again, filling the space he could no longer control. Conversations would come later. Questions would follow. But right now, all that existed was the image of her walking forward without him, without hesitation, without permission. And Ethan Caldwell, the man who had built his life on control, sat perfectly still, realizing for the first time in years that there was nothing in this room he could command, nothing in this moment he could change, and no version of the past he could rewrite before she reached the altar. The music carried her forward, steady and measured, but something in the air had shifted in a way no one else could name. A tension so thin it almost felt imagined, except it was not, because Ethan felt it in the space between each breath he tried to take. His eyes stayed locked on her, not out of choice, but because looking away felt impossible, like turning from something that demanded to be seen, something unfinished. Amara reached the front of the aisle with the same quiet control she had carried from the moment she stepped through the doors, and when she placed her hand into the groom's, the room exhaled as if the story had returned to its expected path. The man beside her stood tall, composed, his posture protective without being possessive, his presence grounded in a kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. Daniel Hayes. The name surfaced in Ethan's mind with delayed recognition, a venture capitalist whose influence had been growing steadily over the past few years, a man who built his reputation on precision and restraint rather than noise. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he watched their hands meet, the contact simple, natural, and entirely unchallenged. The officiant began to speak, his voice calm and measured, weaving words about commitment and trust into the soft rhythm of the ceremony. But Ethan heard none of it clearly. The words blurred into sound, and the sound faded into nothing, replaced instead by fragments of memory that refused to stay buried. Rain against a windshield. A quiet apartment filled with silence that felt heavier than any argument. Amara standing near the window, her arms folded, her voice steady in a way that had unsettled him even then. You do not get to decide what matters for both of us. He had not answered her. Not really. He had chosen distance instead, chosen control, chosen the version of his life that did not include uncertainty or anything that could not be measured, predicted, contained. And now she stood 10 yards away, wrapped in white, stepping into a future he was not part of, as if the years between had not only passed, but had erased him completely. A faint movement near the front row pulled his attention for a brief second, just enough to break the hold she had on his focus. A child shifted in their seat, small enough that their feet did not touch the floor, dressed carefully in soft cream and navy, their posture mirroring the quiet discipline of the adults around them. The child leaned slightly toward the woman beside them, whispering something that drew a gentle smile in return, and then turned their head, curious, observant, scanning the room with an openness that had not yet learned to hide. For a moment, their gaze drifted across the crowd without purpose, until it landed on Ethan. It did not linger long, just a second, maybe less, but it was enough. Enough for something in Ethan's chest to tighten again, sharper this time, more precise. The shape of the child's features was not unfamiliar. The curve of the jaw, the quiet intensity in the eyes, the way their expressions settled into stillness when they were not speaking. It was not exact. It was not obvious. But it was there. Subtle. Unmistakable once seen. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the movement controlled, almost casual, but his focus did not return to the ceremony the way it should have. Instead, it shifted between Amara and the child, drawn into a pattern he could not ignore. The officiant's voice rose slightly, signaling the next step, and Daniel turned toward Amara with a look that carried warmth without spectacle. He spoke softly, his vows measured and sincere. each word landing with intention rather than performance. The guests responded the way they were meant to, with quiet smiles, a few soft nods, the occasional glance exchanged between couples who recognized something of themselves in the moment. It was everything a wedding was supposed to be. It was everything Ethan had never believed in. And yet, sitting there, he could not dismiss it the way he once would have. Because this was not abstract. This was not theory. This was her. Amara's turn came, and the room settled again, the attention shifting fully to her as she faced the man she had chosen. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, but not soft in the way people expected. There was strength in it, clarity, a kind of grounded certainty that did not ask for approval. "I choose you," she said, "not because you saved me, but because you respected me when I did not need saving." The words moved through the room with a quiet weight, subtle enough that most would hear them as beautiful, but specific enough that they carried something deeper for the one person who understood exactly what they meant. Ethan felt them land before he could stop it, not because they were directed at him. They were not. But because they revealed a truth he had never taken the time to understand. Respect had never been part of the equation he offered her. Control had been. Distance had been. Silence had been. The kind of silence that did not protect, but erased. A faint murmur moved through the guests, soft approval, emotional recognition, the natural response to a moment that felt genuine. The officiant smiled, guiding the ceremony forward, but Ethan's attention fractured again as the child near the front shifted once more, this time turning fully in their seat, looking past the rows of guests with a curiosity that did not belong to the script of the day. Their eyes found him again, and this time they stayed. Not with recognition, not with accusation, just with the open, unguarded observation of someone who had not yet learned what to hide. Ethan held the gaze for a second longer than necessary, then looked away, his composure returning in appearance, but not in truth. Because something had already changed. Not in the room, not in the ceremony. In him. The officiant asked for the rings, and Daniel reached for Amara's hand with a steadiness that did not falter, sliding the band into place with a simplicity that carried more weight than any declaration. Applause would come soon. Celebration would follow. The narrative would complete itself the way it was meant to. But beneath the surface of it all, something else had already begun. A question that had not existed when Ethan walked into the room now stood fully formed, impossible to ignore, anchored in the quiet space between a woman he once left behind and a child who had just looked at him twice without knowing why. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell did not have an answer. The applause rose before the moment fully settled, a wave of approval that filled the room with warmth and certainty, the kind that belonged to a story unfolding exactly as expected, and for everyone watching, it felt complete, contained, resolved. But for Ethan, the sound landed differently, not as celebration, but as distance, as confirmation that something had moved forward without him in a way he could no longer interrupt. He remained seated as others stood, his hands resting loosely against his knees, his posture composed enough that no one would question it, yet still enough that it set him apart from the motion around him. Daniel leaned in slightly toward Amara, not in display, but in quiet acknowledgement, and she met him there with the same calm assurance she had carried from the start, their connection unspoken but unmistakable. The officiant's voice guided the final steps, the exchange complete, the words sealed, and when he pronounced them married, the room responded with a brightness that felt almost rehearsed in its perfection. Cameras lifted higher now, no longer subtle, capturing the moment as it crossed from private to public memory. Ethan's gaze shifted again, not toward the couple this time, but toward the front row, toward the small figure who had already unsettled something deeper than he was prepared to examine. The child had turned halfway in their seat, watching the applause with quiet curiosity, their small hands resting neatly in their lap as if they understood the importance of stillness in a room like this. But it was not their posture that held Ethan's attention. It was the way they looked at the moment, not with excitement or distraction, but with a kind of quiet awareness that did not belong to someone so young. As the guests began to settle, transitioning from ceremony to movement, the structured order of the room loosened, conversations returning in soft waves, chairs shifting, footsteps echoing lightly across the marble. Ethan rose slowly, not because he intended to approach, but because remaining seated had begun to feel more noticeable than standing. He adjusted his jacket with a subtle motion, the kind that reset control without drawing attention, and scanned the room once more, this time with purpose. He told himself it was observation. It was not. Amara stepped down from the platform with Daniel beside her, their movements aligned without effort, and for a brief second, she paused near the front row, her attention drawn not to the crowd, but to the child. The shift in her expression was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a softening that did not weaken her composure, only deepened it. She reached out, her hand steady, and the child responded immediately, rising without hesitation, placing their smaller hand into hers with a familiarity that did not need to be explained. The gesture was simple, natural, but it carried a weight that pressed against something in Ethan's chest with growing clarity. He took a step forward before he could stop himself, the movement small enough to blend into the general flow of guests repositioning, but deliberate enough that it closed the distance just slightly. He did not approach fully. He did not speak. He did not break the boundary that had already been drawn. But he moved, and in that movement, something shifted again. The child glanced up at Amara, then back toward the room, their eyes scanning without urgency until they found him once more. This time, there was a flicker of something different, not recognition, not yet, but a question forming behind their gaze, subtle and unspoken. Ethan held still, his expression controlled, but inside, the alignment of details he had been resisting began to settle into place. Timing, age, presence, absence. The variables he had spent years mastering in business now turned inward, constructing a possibility he had not allowed himself to consider. Daniel's voice broke softly into the moment, speaking to Amara with a warmth that was steady and grounded, and she responded with a nod, her attention returning fully to him, to the life she had chosen, to the direction she was moving without hesitation. The child stayed close to her side, their hands still in hers, their presence no longer a background detail, but a central part of the picture Ethan could no longer ignore. Guests began to approach, offering congratulations, forming a natural barrier that shifted the couple further into the center of the room and pushed Ethan back toward the edges without a word being spoken. He allowed it. He did not force his way forward. He did not announce himself. That was not the man he had built himself to be. But for the first time, restraint did not feel like control. It felt like distance. Necessary. Unchosen. A server passed nearby with a tray of champagne flutes, the soft clink of glass cutting through the layered conversations, and Ethan took one without looking, more out of habit than intention. The cool surface of the glass grounded him briefly, something tangible in a moment that had become increasingly abstract. He lifted it slightly, not to drink, but to hold, to occupy his hands, to maintain the appearance of normalcy in a room where everything still looked exactly as it should. But nothing felt that way anymore. Across the room, Amara turned slightly, adjusting her position as she acknowledged another guest, and for a fraction of a second, her gaze passed over him again. This time, it did not pause. It did not hold. It did not acknowledge. It moved past him as if he were part of the room itself, present, but irrelevant. The message was clear. Whatever he had been, whatever they had shared, whatever he had left behind, it no longer had a place in her present. And yet, the child remained. A quiet, undeniable connection that existed whether he stepped forward or not. Ethan lowered the glass slightly, his fingers tightening just enough to register the shift beneath his controlled exterior. He had built his life on certainty, on decisions made with clarity and finality, on the belief that once something was left behind, it stayed there. But standing in that room, watching a woman he once knew better than anyone walk forward without him, while a child who might carry a piece of him stood quietly at her side, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Not regret. Not yet. Something earlier than that. Something sharper. Realization. And it arrived without warning, without permission, settling into place with a weight that did not ask to be understood, only acknowledged. The room shifted from ceremony into celebration with the smooth precision of something carefully orchestrated. Conversations rising in overlapping layers, laughter threading through the soft clink of glass and silver, and yet beneath it all, a quieter current moved, one that did not belong to the script everyone else followed. Ethan stood at the edge of that current, outwardly composed, inwardly recalibrating, his attention no longer scattered, but narrowing with intent that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something he could not yet define. The band transitioned into a softer arrangement near the far side of the ballroom, a piano carrying the melody now, subtle and controlled, allowing voices to fill the space without competition. Guests began to circulate, forming small clusters of conversation, congratulating, observing, analyzing, each interaction a thread in the social fabric of the event. Ethan moved with them, not directly, but in parallel, maintaining the illusion of participation while his focus remained fixed on a single point across the room. Amara stood near the center, receiving congratulations with a calm presence that never overextended, her smile measured, her responses precise, never lingering too long, never allowing herself to be held in place. Daniel remained close, not overshadowing her, but anchoring the space around her with a quiet assurance that made interruption feel inappropriate. And the child stayed within reach, never drifting far, their small hand occasionally brushing against the fabric of her dress, as if that connection was both instinct and certainty. Ethan took a slow step forward, then another, each movement absorbed into the general flow of guests shifting positions, but the direction was clear. He was closing distance. Not quickly, not abruptly, but deliberately. A man like him did not rush into unknown territory. He assessed. He adjusted. He approached. A familiar voice brushed past him, someone attempting casual recognition, a greeting offered with polite expectation, but Ethan acknowledged it with a brief nod and nothing more, his attention already moving past the interaction before it fully formed. Whatever conversations he would normally entertain held no weight here. Not now. Not in this room. As he drew closer, detail sharpened. The texture of Amara's dress caught the light with subtle movement, not extravagant, but intentional, designed to reflect without overwhelming. The quiet strength in her posture had not wavered once, not when she walked the aisle, not during the vows, not now. She existed in the space as if it belonged to her, not because she demanded it, but because she did not question it. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because there had been a time when she questioned everything he gave her. When she waited, when she asked, when she stayed. The memory surfaced without invitation. A late evening. Her voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear. I needed you to choose me. He had looked at her, then the same way he had looked at everything that complicated his life. As something to manage, something to minimize, something to step away from until it resolved itself without him. And it had, just not in the way he expected. The child shifted again, stepping slightly away from the immediate circle of adults, drawn by something simple, perhaps curiosity, perhaps restlessness, their attention moving toward a nearby table where small arrangements of white flowers sat untouched. Their fingers hovered near one of the petals, not grabbing, not disrupting, just observing the shape, the softness, the way it responded to the air. Ethan's steps slowed as he reached a point where the distance between them was no longer abstract. He was close enough now to hear the cadence of Amara's voice as she spoke to a guest, close enough to see the subtle shift in her expression as she listened, responded, redirected. Close enough that leaving would now be noticeable. He stopped, not directly in front of her, not yet, but within the same space, within reach of acknowledgement. The child turned again, their movement unplanned, their attention drifting until it landed on him for the third time. This time, there was no immediate shift away, no passing glance, just a quiet, steady look that lingered long enough to change the air between them. Ethan did not speak. He did not move closer, but he did not look away. Not this time. The silence between them was not empty. It was forming, the kind that held a question without words, the kind that waited. A woman near Amara stepped aside, creating a natural opening in the circle, and for a brief second, there was nothing between them. No guests, no movement, just space. Amara felt it before she saw it. Her posture did not change, but her awareness shifted, her gaze lifting slightly as she turned, and when her eyes met Ethan's again, there was no surprise in them. Only recognition. Controlled. Intentional. Final. She excused herself from the conversation with a quiet word, her tone polite, her exit seamless, and then she stepped toward him, not quickly, not slowly, but with the same measured pace she had carried from the beginning. Daniel remained where he was, his attention following her movement without tension, without urgency, but with awareness. He did not intervene. He did not call her back. He simply watched, as if he understood something about this moment that did not require interruption. Amara stopped at a distance that was precise, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to maintain a boundary that did not need to be explained. The child stood slightly behind her now, their presence still, their attention divided between the two adults in front of them. Ethan's voice, when it came, was lower than usual, not weaker, not uncertain, but adjusted, as if the room itself required something different from him. "You did not tell me." The words were simple, direct. They did not carry accusation. They carried something else, something incomplete. Amara held his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her composure intact. There was no rush to answer, no need to fill the silence he had created. When she spoke, her voice was steady, quiet, and absolute. "You did not stay?" The words landed with more force than anything raised in anger could have carried. No volume, no emphasis, just truth, delivered without decoration. The noise of the room continued around them, conversations rising and falling, glasses touching, music threading through it all, but in that small space between them, everything else had already faded. Ethan inhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the moment had shifted beyond his control, beyond his preparation, beyond the systems he relied on to navigate every other part of his life. His gaze moved, just for a second, toward the child, then back to her, the question no longer forming, but present, undeniable. Amara did not follow his gaze. She did not need to. She already knew where it would go, and in the quiet space between them, with nothing left to obscure what had already been revealed, the truth did not arrive with a declaration. It arrived with stillness, with presence, with the simple fact that what he had left behind had not disappeared. It had continued. Without him, the space between them did not break, even as the room continued to move, as laughter rose and glasses met and music carried on without pause. Because what existed in that moment was not part of the celebration. It was something separate, something that had been waiting long before either of them stepped into that room. Ethan held her gaze, not with authority, not with expectation, but with a focus that had shifted from control to understanding, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was no calculation behind it, only the need to know what had already become undeniable. The child remained just behind Amara, quiet, observant, their small presence grounded in stillness that mirrored her own, and yet there was a difference now, a subtle awareness that something important was unfolding, even if they did not yet understand the shape of it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice measured, stripped of the edge it once carried, as if the room itself demanded honesty where he had once relied on distance. How long? The question was incomplete, but it did not need to be finished. Amara understood it before the final word could form, because she had lived the answer in ways he had chosen not to see. Her expression did not shift, not toward anger, not toward softness, but toward something steadier, something that did not move with his presence. "Long enough," she said, her tone even, her eyes unwavering. "Long enough to learn that silence is also a choice." The words did not accuse. They did not rise. They settled. And in that settling, they carried more weight than anything louder could have. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because there had been a time when silence had been his solution, his strategy, his way of stepping away without confrontation, without explanation, without consequence. He had believed that leaving something unspoken made it easier, cleaner, manageable. But standing here, he could see the result of that choice standing in front of him, not broken, not waiting, but rebuilt in a way that did not include him. His gaze shifted again, drawn not by curiosity now, but by something closer to certainty, toward the child who stood quietly within reach, their eyes moving between the two adults with a calm attentiveness that felt older than it should. "What is their name?" The question came softer, not because it lacked importance, but because it carried too much of it. Amara did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, not out of avoidance, but because the moment required precision, the kind that could not be rushed. She turned slightly, her hand lowering just enough to rest gently against the child's shoulder, grounding them in place without pulling them forward. "This is Lila," she said, her voice steady, clear, unembellished. Lila did not step forward. She did not hide. She simply looked at Ethan, her gaze open, curious, unguarded in the way only someone who had not been taught to protect themselves from this kind of moment could be. Ethan felt the name settle in his chest with a weight that did not belong to sound alone. Lila. It did not echo. It anchored. He studied her face, not searching now, not analyzing, but seeing, truly seeing, the details he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The alignment of expression, the quiet focus, the stillness that spoke louder than movement. And in that recognition, something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, past realization, past denial, into something that did not offer immediate resolution. Responsibility. He had built his life on outcomes he could predict, on decisions that led to measurable results, on a world where cause and effect followed patterns he understood. But this was not that world. This was something that had continued without his input, had grown without his presence, had formed a reality he had no part in shaping, and yet could not deny belonged to him in a way nothing else ever had. Lila tilted her head slightly, her voice soft, but clear, carrying the natural honesty of a question that had not been filtered or restrained. "Do you know my mom?" The simplicity of it cut through everything else. There was no accusation in it, no awareness of history, just curiosity, direct and unguarded. Ethan's breath caught for the briefest moment, not visibly, not in a way that broke his composure, but enough that the answer did not come immediately. He looked at Amara, not for permission, but because the truth between them required acknowledgement before it could be spoken aloud. She did not intervene. She did not soften the moment. She allowed it to stand exactly as it was, because anything less would have undone everything she had built. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, just enough to meet Lila at her level, his voice quieter now, not diminished, but grounded in something he had not used in a very long time. "Yes," he said, "I used to." The answer was honest, but incomplete, and they all knew it. Lila considered it for a second, her expression thoughtful, then nodded slightly, as if filing it away without judgment, without urgency, accepting it for what it was without needing more. She did not ask another question. She did not press. She simply returned to stillness, her small hand resting lightly against Amara's side, anchored again in the place she belonged. The moment stretched, not awkward, not unresolved, but full, carrying everything that had not yet been said and everything that might never be. Around them, the reception continued, voices rising, music shifting, life moving forward without pause. But within that space, time had already changed direction. Ethan straightened slightly, not retreating, not advancing, but adjusting to the weight of what had just settled into place. He looked at Amaro again, this time without the distance he had carried before, without the assumption that he understood the outcome before it unfolded. "I did not know," he said, the words simple, stripped of defense, carrying no justification, no attempt to reshape the past into something more acceptable. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression steady, her presence unmoved by the statement, because whether he knew or not had never been the point. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, but final, carrying the clarity of someone who had already walked through everything he was just beginning to face. "You did not ask." The words closed the space between them not with force, but with truth, and in that truth, there was no room left for interpretation. Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, not because he did not understand, but because for the first time, there was nothing left to control, nothing left to redirect, nothing left to manage. Only something to accept. And acceptance, he realized, was not something he had ever learned to do. The words did not echo, but they remained, suspended between them with a quiet permanence that neither of them could undo. And for a moment, Ethan did not move, not because he did not understand, but because understanding had finally reached a place where it could not be redirected into something easier. Around them, the reception continued to unfold with effortless elegance, servers gliding between guests with trays of champagne and plated hors d'oeuvres, soft laughter rising in measured bursts, conversations weaving together into a low hum that filled the room without ever overwhelming it. But inside the small space they occupied, everything had already shifted into something else entirely. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture returning out of habit, but the precision he usually carried now felt different, less like control and more like an attempt to remain steady in a moment that refused to be managed. His gaze lingered on Lila again, not searching this time, not questioning, but acknowledging, taking in the reality of her presence without resistance. And in that simple act, something within him began to recalibrate in a way he had never experienced before. Amara remained composed, her attention no longer fixed solely on him, but aware of everything at once, the room, the movement, the expectations that came with a moment like this. And yet she did not rush to leave, did not pull away, did not dissolve the space that had formed between them, because this, too, was part of her control, the ability to stand in truth without needing to escape it. Daniel approached then, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a calm presence that matched the tone he had carried from the beginning, his steps measured, his expression steady as he came to stand beside Amara, close enough to be part of the moment, but not intruding on it. His gaze moved briefly to Ethan, not with hostility, not with challenge, but with a quiet recognition that acknowledged exactly who he was and exactly what this moment meant without needing explanation. There was no tension in his stance, only awareness, and that alone carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Amara turned her head slightly toward him, her expression softening just enough to signal something private, something grounded, and he responded with the smallest nod, the kind that did not interrupt, but confirmed presence. Lila looked up at Daniel instinctively, her small hand shifting from Amara's side to reach for his, and he took it without hesitation, his grip gentle, natural, practiced in a way that spoke of consistency rather than performance. The movement was simple, but it landed with clarity, forming a picture that did not require explanation. Ethan saw it, not just the action, but the meaning beneath it. Stability, presence, choice, the things he had not given, the things someone else had stepped into without needing to be asked. He exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now, not because he lacked strength, but because the moment no longer allowed for anything else. She calls him Dad. The statement was not a question, but it carried one within it, unspoken, unresolved. Amara did not look away. She did not hesitate. She answered with the same clarity she had carried through every word she had spoken to him. She calls the man who stayed her father. The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. They were exact, and in that exactness, they left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in rejection, but in the quiet recognition of something he could not undo. The truth did not accuse him. It did not need to. It simply existed, grounded in years he had not been part of, in moments he had not witnessed, in choices he had made without fully understanding their weight. Lila looked between them again, her expression thoughtful, sensing the shift in tone even if she could not name it, her small fingers tightening slightly around Daniel's hand, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if grounding herself in something familiar while the unfamiliar moved around her. Ethan lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, the first visible sign that the version of control he had built his life on was no longer applicable here. When he looked up again, his voice carried something new, something that had not existed in him before, not weakness, not uncertainty, but a kind of honesty that did not try to protect itself. I should have stayed. The admission was simple, but it shifted the air again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that even the surrounding noise seemed to fall slightly out of focus. Amara held his gaze, her expression unchanged, because the statement, while true, did not alter the reality she had already built. Her voice, when she spoke, remained steady, grounded in something that had long since moved beyond his reach. You should have chosen. The correction was precise, and it mattered, because staying and choosing were not the same, and she had learned that difference without him. Daniel's presence remained constant beside her, his attention not fixed on Ethan, but on the moment as a whole, understanding without interference, offering stability without dominance. He did not speak. He did not need to. His role had already been defined through years of presence rather than a single exchange. Ethan nodded once, a small movement, controlled, but real, accepting the distinction she had drawn without attempting to reshape it into something more comfortable. The music shifted again in the background, a slower rhythm now, signaling the transition deeper into the reception, into dancing, into celebration, into a future that was already unfolding regardless of what had just been said. Guests began to move toward the center of the room, drawn by the change, their attention shifting naturally away from isolated conversations and toward the shared experience of the evening. Amara glanced briefly toward the dance floor, then back at Ethan, not with invitation, not with expectation, but with finality, the kind that does not close a door loudly, but simply moves forward without looking back. Lila tugged gently at Daniel's hand, her attention already shifting toward the music, toward the movement, toward something lighter, something easier, and he responded with a soft smile, nodding slightly as he guided her a step forward, not pulling her away from Amara, but including her in the next moment. Ethan remained where he was, watching as the space between them changed once more, not with confrontation, not with resolution, but with direction. They were moving forward, together, without him, and for the first time, he did not try to follow. Not yet, because standing there, in the middle of a room filled with light and sound and celebration, he understood something he had never fully allowed himself to understand before. That some moments do not ask for control. They ask for acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, once it arrives, changes everything. The music drew people toward the center of the room in a slow, effortless pull, a soft piano layered beneath a steady rhythm that invited movement without demanding it. And as couples began to step onto the polished floor, the space transformed again, shifting from conversation into something more fluid, more intimate, more alive. Ethan remained where he stood, just outside that motion, his body still, his gaze following the direction Amara had taken without consciously deciding to do so. She moved with the same quiet control she had carried through the entire evening, but there was something lighter in her now, something that belonged to this moment rather than the one she had just left behind. Daniel guided Lila gently toward the edge of the dance floor, his hand steady, his attention split between her excitement and the awareness of everything else unfolding around them. Lila looked up at him with a small, bright curiosity, her earlier stillness softened by the shift in energy, and when he nodded toward the music, she stepped forward without hesitation, her small shoes tapping lightly against the floor as she found the rhythm in her own way. Amara followed a step behind, not leading, not directing, but present, her eyes resting on Lila with a quiet warmth that did not need to be displayed to be understood. Ethan watched it all with a focus that had changed shape again, no longer anchored in the confrontation that had just passed, but in the life that existed beyond it, the life that had continued, grown, and formed something whole without him. He could see it clearly now, not as an abstract idea, but as something tangible, something structured, something real. The three of them moved within the same space with an ease that could not be manufactured, an alignment that came from time, from presence, from choices made consistently rather than declared once. And for the first time, Ethan understood that what he was looking at was not a moment he had been excluded from. It was a life he had never entered. A woman passed by him with a soft laugh, brushing his shoulder lightly as she moved toward the dance floor, and he stepped aside automatically, adjusting his position without thinking, his body still operating on the habits he had built over years of navigating crowded rooms and controlled environments. But this room was no longer something he could navigate the same way. There were no negotiations here, no leverage, no strategy that would allow him to step into what he had already left behind. The music deepened slightly, the tempo settling into something slower, and Daniel turned toward Amara, extending his hand with a quiet familiarity that did not need to ask for permission. She took it without hesitation, her fingers resting naturally in his, and together they stepped onto the floor, their movements aligned in a way that spoke of comfort rather than performance. Lila remained close at first, watching them with open curiosity, her small hands mimicking the rhythm before she attempted a few steps of her own, her laughter soft but present, threading through the music in a way that drew a few gentle smiles from those nearby. Ethan's chest tightened again, not sharply, not painfully, but with a steady pressure that did not fade, because what he was seeing was not just a moment of joy. It was proof of something that did not need him to exist. proof of something that had not waited for him to return. His gaze shifted briefly to the surrounding guests, noticing now the way a few of them glanced between him and the dance floor, subtle, curious, connecting pieces they did not fully understand but could not ignore. The story was already forming in their minds. The powerful man standing alone. The woman he once knew moving forward without him. The child who fit somewhere in between. He was used to being observed. He was used to being analyzed. But never like this. Never in a way that stripped him of control and left only truth in its place. Ethan lifted the glass he still held, taking a small sip now, the cool champagne grounding him just enough to steady his breathing. But it did not change what he saw when he looked back toward them. Amara turned slightly as she moved, her eyes briefly catching the light, and for a fraction of a second, her gaze passed over him again. There was no pause, no acknowledgement, just a continuation of motion, a clear indication that whatever existed between them no longer held space in her present. And that, more than anything, settled something inside him that had been resisting until now. Because it was no longer a question of what had happened. It was a question of what existed now. Lila spun lightly in place, her movement uncoordinated but full of joy, and Daniel laughed softly, steadying her with a gentle hand before guiding her back into rhythm. Amara watched them with a quiet smile, her presence relaxed in a way it had not been earlier, her shoulders no longer carrying the tension of the confrontation, her focus fully grounded in the moment she had chosen. Ethan lowered his glass slowly, his fingers loosening around it as the weight in his chest shifted again, not disappearing, not easing, but transforming into something clearer. He had spent years believing that absence was neutral, that walking away simply removed him from a situation without consequence beyond his own experience. But standing there now, watching a child laugh beside a man who had stepped into the space he had left behind, he understood that absence was not neutral. It shaped everything. It created space for someone else to fill. It defined what would grow in its place. A soft voice approached from his side, someone attempting to draw him back into the room, into conversation, into normalcy, but he barely registered it, offering a polite response without truly hearing the words, because his attention had already shifted inward, towards something that could not be avoided any longer. The music swelled again, the dance floor filling more fully now, bodies moving in rhythm, light reflecting off polished surfaces, creating an image of celebration that would be remembered as perfect by everyone else in the room. But for Ethan, perfection had already been redefined. It was not the elegance, not the music, not the flawless execution of the event. It was the quiet certainty of a life built without him that no longer needed to explain itself. He took a step back, just one, subtle enough that no one would notice, but enough to shift his position from observer to outsider, from presence to distance. And in that step, there was no retreat, no avoidance, only recognition. Because for the first time, he was not trying to move closer. He was understanding why he could not. The distance he created did not dissolve the connection. It only made it clearer, sharper, more defined, like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the full composition instead of the individual strokes. And as Ethan stood there, slightly removed from the center of the room, he began to understand that what he had been trying to interpret piece by piece could only be understood as a whole. The music continued to carry the room forward, couples turning in slow arcs across the floor, laughter threading between notes, light catching on glass and fabric in a way that made everything feel almost unreal, like a moment designed to be remembered rather than questioned. But Ethan was no longer inside that illusion. He was outside of it, seeing what it was built on, and more importantly, what it had been built without. Amara moved through the dance with a calm rhythm that did not draw attention to itself, yet held it anyway. Her steps aligned with Daniel's in a way that suggested familiarity beyond practice, something earned over time rather than learned for display. Lila remained close, sometimes stepping in, sometimes stepping out, her movements small but expressive, her presence weaving naturally between them as if she had always belonged there, as if there had never been a version of this life that looked any different. Ethan watched the way Daniel adjusted without thinking, how he slowed his pace slightly when Lila moved closer, how he shifted his hand just enough to guide without restricting, how he looked at Amara not with possession, but with respect, and it was that detail, more than anything else, that settled something deep inside Ethan with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. Respect. It had been such a simple thing, such an obvious thing, and yet it had been the one thing he had never truly offered her. A group of guests passed between him and the dance floor, their movement briefly obscuring his view, their conversation light and unaware, and for a moment, the image disappeared behind them, but it did not leave him. It remained, fully formed, carried in his mind with more permanence than anything happening in front of him now. When the space cleared again, the scene had not changed, but his understanding of it had. This was not about what he had lost. It was about what he had never chosen to build. The music shifted slightly, the tempo lifting just enough to draw a few more people onto the floor, and the energy of the room followed. Rising without becoming chaotic, maintaining the same controlled elegance that had defined the evening from the start. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not to avoid what he was seeing, but to collect something within himself that had begun to shift beyond recognition. His reflection caught faintly in the polished surface of a nearby column, distorted slightly by the curve of the marble, but recognizable enough to hold his attention for a second longer than intended. He saw the same man the world recognized. Composed, controlled, successful, untouched. But now, for the first time, that image felt incomplete. Not because it lacked anything externally, but because it had been built on the absence of something he could no longer deny mattered. A voice approached again, closer this time, more insistent, a familiar tone wrapped in polite curiosity, but Ethan responded with the same measured detachment, acknowledging without engaging, because whatever conversations were being offered no longer held relevance in a moment that had already redefined his priorities without asking for his consent. Across the room, Amara stepped away from the center of the dance floor, her movement fluid, unforced, guiding Lila gently with her as the music transitioned again, and Daniel followed without hesitation, the three of them shifting naturally toward the edge of the space where the noise softened slightly, where the rhythm of the room could be observed rather than participated in. It was a small movement, but it created an opening, not an invitation, just space. Ethan noticed it immediately, not because he was searching for it, but because his attention had already aligned with their movement in a way he could not redirect. He did not move at first. He remained where he was, allowing the moment to settle, allowing the instinct to act to pass through him without immediately responding to it. This was new. The restraint was not strategic. It was reflective. Lila leaned slightly against Amara's side, her earlier energy softening into something quieter, her small hand absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the fabric at Amara's waist as she watched the dancers continue, her focus drifting in and out of the motion with the natural ease of a child who felt secure enough not to hold on to any one thing too tightly. Daniel spoke softly to her, something light, something simple, and she responded with a small smile, her attention lifting again, her presence grounded not in the room, but in the people beside her. Ethan took a breath, slow, measured, and then he moved. Not forward in the way he had earlier, not with the same underlying urgency, but with intention shaped by understanding rather than impulse. Each step was deliberate, quiet, absorbed into the movement of the room, but directed with clarity. He stopped again at a distance that respected the boundary that had already been established, his posture steady, his gaze level, not demanding attention, not forcing engagement, but present. Amara noticed him almost immediately, not because he drew attention, but because she was aware of everything that mattered within her space. Her expression did not change, but her focus shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence without inviting it. Daniel's gaze followed hers for a brief moment, his attention settling on Ethan with the same calm awareness he had carried before, but there was something new now, not tension, not concern, but a quiet readiness, the kind that comes from understanding that some moments do not repeat, but continue. Ethan did not speak right away. He let the silence exist, not as avoidance, but as acknowledgement, allowing the weight of what had already been said to remain intact. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, grounded, carrying none of the authority he once relied on, but something else entirely. I am not here to disrupt anything. The statement was simple, but it mattered, because it defined his position without attempting to claim space that was not his. Amara held his gaze for a moment, measuring not the words, but the intention behind them, and when she responded, her voice carried the same clarity it always had. Then do not. The words were not harsh. They were not soft. They were exact. And in that exactness, they set the boundary again, not as a barrier, but as a line that would not be moved. Ethan nodded once, accepting it without resistance, because for the first time, he was not trying to move the line. He was learning how to stand on his side of it. Lila looked up at him again, her expression curious, thoughtful, as if she sensed that something had shifted, even if she could not define what it was. And in her gaze, there was no judgment, no expectation, only openness. And that openness, more than anything else, made what came next matter more than anything he had said before. The openness in Lila's gaze did not demand anything, but it invited something, and that distinction settled into Ethan with a clarity that felt unfamiliar, because he was used to expectations, to negotiations, to moments that required a response shaped by outcome. But this was different. This was a moment that required presence without guarantee, honesty without control. The music continued behind them, softer now, the rhythm easing into something almost ambient as conversations resumed around the edges of the room, laughter rising and falling in gentle waves, but the space between the four of them remained distinct, held in a quiet balance that no one rushed to disturb. Ethan lowered his shoulders slightly, not in surrender, but in release, as if something he had been holding without realizing it had finally loosened its grip. He looked at Lila again, not with the weight of recognition pressing down, but with a steadiness that allowed him to meet her where she stood, without projecting anything onto her that did not belong. "Hi," he said, his voice even, simple, without performance. Lila blinked once, then smiled slightly, the kind of small, polite smile a child offers when meeting someone new, her response immediate, unguarded. "Hi." The exchange was brief, almost insignificant to anyone watching, but within it, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to change the direction of what might come next. Ethan paused, just long enough to let the moment settle, to ensure he was not moving too quickly, not stepping into something he had not earned the right to approach. "What are you watching?" The question came gently, neutral, grounded in her perspective rather than his own. Lila glanced back toward the dance floor, her attention following the movement of the guests for a second before returning to him. "They look funny when they turn," she said, her voice soft but certain, her small hand lifting slightly as if tracing the motion she had just observed. Ethan followed her gesture, watching the same movement, the way couples spun and shifted, the slight imbalance that came before they corrected themselves. And for the first time that evening, something close to a smile touched his expression, not wide, not forced, but real. "They do," he said, "especially when they think no one is looking." Lila nodded as if that confirmed something she had already suspected, her attention settling comfortably into the exchange, her presence no longer just observing, but participating. Amara watched the interaction without interruption, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not know her. But beneath that stillness, there was awareness, measured, precise, allowing the moment to exist without guiding it, without shaping it, without protecting it from what it might become. Daniel remained beside her, his stance relaxed, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Lila with a quiet attentiveness that did not interfere, but did not disengage either. He was present in a way that did not need to assert itself. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that what he said next mattered in a way that words rarely had for him before. "Do you like it here?" The question was simple, but it carried an intention that went beyond small talk, an attempt to understand her world rather than insert himself into it. Lila tilted her head slightly, considering, her answer thoughtful rather than immediate. "I like the music," she said, "and the cake looks good." The honesty in her response drew a quiet breath from Ethan, something lighter than anything he had felt since he entered the room, and he nodded, accepting her answer exactly as she gave it. "Those are good reasons," he said. "The best ones, probably." Lila smiled again, a little wider this time, her shoulders relaxing as the exchange settled into something natural, something unforced. Around them, a few guests passed by, their attention briefly catching on the small group before moving on, their curiosity subtle but present, sensing that something important was happening without fully understanding what it was. Ethan glanced up briefly, aware of the observation, but for once, it did not redirect him, did not pull him back into the version of himself that managed perception above all else. He returned his focus to Lila, grounding himself in the moment rather than the room. Amara shifted slightly, her hand resting lightly against Lila's shoulder again, not to interrupt, but to maintain connection, to ensure that the space remained anchored in her presence. Her eyes moved to Ethan, not questioning, not inviting, but measuring, always measuring, not his words, but the consistency beneath them. Ethan met her gaze for a second, acknowledging it, not challenging it, then looked back to Lila, because that was where his attention needed to remain if this moment was to mean anything at all. "Do you dance?" he asked, the question light, but intentional. Lila glanced toward the floor again, then back at him, her expression brightening slightly. "A little," she said, lifting her hand again as if demonstrating, her small movements quick, unpolished, but full of confidence. Ethan nodded, watching, not correcting, not guiding, just observing. "That is better than most people out there," he said quietly, and this time, the hint of humor in his voice was unmistakable. Lila laughed softly, a small sound, but genuine, and it carried through the space in a way that shifted something else again, something that had been tight, now easing just slightly. Daniel's gaze moved briefly to Amara, a silent exchange passing between them, something understood without words, something acknowledged without needing to be spoken aloud. Ethan felt it, not as exclusion, but as context, as part of the structure he was only beginning to understand. The music swelled again slightly, signaling another shift in the rhythm of the evening, and Lila's attention followed it, her body turning instinctively toward the floor, her curiosity pulling her back into the movement she had been watching. She looked up at Amara, then at Daniel, then briefly back at Ethan, her expression open, as if including him in the moment without knowing exactly how. Ethan held her gaze for a second, then nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that did not claim space, but did not withdraw either. "Go on," he said softly. She did not hesitate. She stepped back toward the dance floor, her small figure moving with purpose, Daniel following closely, his hand ready but not restricting, Amara just behind them, her presence steady, her attention balanced between them and everything else around her. Ethan remained where he was, watching as they moved away, but this time, the distance did not feel like separation. It felt like perspective, because for the first time since he had walked into that room, he was not looking at what he had lost. He was looking at what existed, and understanding, finally, that if he wanted to be part of anything moving forward, it would not come from stepping in. It would come from earning a place that had already been filled. The distance between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a line drawn with intention, one that defined where things had been and where they could go. And as Ethan stood there watching Lila rejoin the motion of the dance floor, he understood that crossing that line would not be a step, it would be a process. The music carried her back into movement with ease, her small figure weaving between the slower steps of the adults, her laughter threading lightly through the rhythm, and Daniel adjusted again, without hesitation, lowering his pace, guiding without directing, allowing her to find her place within the flow rather than forcing her into it. Amara followed with the same quiet presence, her attention balanced, her awareness constant, and for a moment, the three of them formed something so complete, so naturally aligned, that it did not look like something that had been built. It looked like something that had always been there. Ethan's gaze remained steady, not searching, not reaching, simply observing with a clarity that had finally replaced the urgency he had carried earlier. He saw now what he had refused to see before. Not just the presence of another man, not just the existence of a child, but the structure of something that had been created through time, through consistency, through choices made when no one was watching. He had always understood systems, understood how things were built step by step, decision by decision. But this was different, because this system had been built without him, and yet he could recognize its strength immediately. A server passed near him again, offering a fresh glass, and this time he declined with a slight shake of his head, his attention too anchored to the moment to be divided, his usual habits falling away without resistance. The room continued to move, conversations deepening, laughter growing warmer, the evening settling into a rhythm that felt less formal, more personal. But Ethan remained slightly outside of it, not excluded, but intentionally separate, because he understood now that stepping fully into the room required more than presence. It required belonging. And belonging was not something he could claim simply by being there. Lila spun again, her movements more confident now, her small feet finding a pattern that was uniquely hers, and when she stumbled slightly, Daniel steadied her with a light touch, his hand firm enough to support, gentle enough not to interrupt, and she laughed again, the sound bright, unburdened, unguarded. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, persistent, a recognition that went beyond observation and settled into something closer to understanding. He had not just missed moments. He had missed foundations. He had not just been absent. He had allowed something to grow without him, something that did not need him, something that had already defined itself in ways he could not change. The realization did not push him away. It grounded him. It clarified what had been unclear, what had been abstract, what had been easy to dismiss when it existed only in theory. Now it was real. Now it was visible. Now it was undeniable. A slight movement drew his attention again as Amara stepped back from the dance floor, her hand brushing lightly against Lila's shoulder as she spoke something soft, something only the child needed to hear, and Lila nodded, her energy shifting, her attention redirecting toward a nearby table where a small arrangement of desserts had been placed. Daniel followed her with a glance, then turned back to Amara, their eyes meeting for a brief second, a silent exchange passing between them that did not require words, and then he moved toward Lila, his presence continuing seamlessly, his role never questioned, never disrupted. Amara remained where she was for a moment, her posture still, her gaze lifting slightly, as if sensing something beyond the immediate space, and when her eyes found Ethan again, there was no hesitation in it, no surprise, no avoidance, just awareness. She took a step toward him, not drawn, not compelled, but choosing to close the distance on her own terms, her movement measured, controlled, the same way it had been from the beginning. Ethan did not move to meet her. He stayed where he was, allowing her to approach, not out of passivity, but out of respect for the boundary she had already defined. When she stopped in front of him, the space between them was precise again, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain clarity. The music softened slightly behind them, the sound folding into the background, allowing their voices to exist without competition. "You understand now," she said, her tone calm, not questioning, not testing, but stating something she had already seen in his expression. Ethan held her gaze, his answer immediate, not rehearsed, not calculated, but grounded in what he had finally allowed himself to see. "I do." The words were simple, but they carried weight, because understanding, for him, had never been about words. It had always been about action. And this time, the action was internal, a shift that did not announce itself, but changed everything that would follow. Amara studied him for a second longer, not looking for apology, not expecting explanation, but confirming something within herself, something that had already been decided long before he arrived. "Understanding does not change what is," she said quietly, her voice steady, her presence unwavering. Ethan nodded once, accepting the truth in it without resistance, because for the first time, he was not trying to change what was. He was trying to face it. "I know," he replied, his tone even, but there was something else beneath it now, something that had not been there before. Not hope, not expectation, something simpler. Willingness. Amara's gaze did not soften, but it shifted slightly, acknowledging the difference, recognizing the change without responding to it, because change, she had learned, was not proven in a moment. It was proven over time. Lila's voice carried faintly from across the room, calling out something small, something bright, and Daniel responded immediately, his attention turning toward her without delay, and Amara glanced in their direction, her focus moving naturally, instinctively, before returning to Ethan for one final moment. "This is not your place," she said, not harshly, not coldly, but with clarity that did not need to be softened. It was not a rejection. It was a truth. Ethan felt it land, not as a barrier, but as a definition, a clear understanding of where he stood in a space that had already been established without him. He did not argue. He did not step forward. He did not attempt to reshape the moment into something else. He simply nodded again, his voice quiet, but certain. Not yet. The words were not a challenge. They were not a demand. They were an acknowledgement of distance, of process, of something that would require more than presence to change. Amara held his gaze for a second longer, then turned, her movement smooth, her attention shifting fully back to the life she had built, leaving him standing exactly where he belonged in that moment. At the edge, not excluded, not erased, but not included either. And for the first time, Ethan did not try to step out of that position. He stood in it, fully, understanding that where he stood now was not the end of something. It was the beginning of what it would take to earn anything beyond it. The edge did not feel temporary anymore. It felt defined, like a place that required intention to leave rather than impulse to escape. And as Ethan stood there, watching Amara return to the rhythm of the evening, he understood that nothing about this moment would move quickly, not because it could not, but because it should not. The music carried on, rising and falling with a softness that wrapped around the room like a steady breath, and the guests leaned into it. Their movements relaxed now, their conversations deeper, the formal distance of the ceremony replaced by something warmer, something lived in rather than performed. Ethan remained where he was, not because he did not know where to go, but because for the first time, he was choosing to stay exactly where he belonged in that moment. Not in the center, not beside her, not within the space he once occupied without question, but here, just outside of it. And that choice, small as it seemed, marked a shift he could not ignore. Across the room, Lila reached for a small dessert, her fingers careful as she lifted it from the tray, her attention fully absorbed in the simple joy of it. And Daniel crouched slightly beside her, speaking quietly, something light, something that made her smile before she took a careful bite, her expression brightening in a way that did not need approval to exist. Amara stood just behind them, her presence calm, her gaze moving between them with a quiet attentiveness that did not control, but remained ready, always ready. Ethan watched the interaction without stepping closer, without interrupting, allowing himself to see it for what it was rather than what it could have been. He noticed the way Daniel waited for Lila to finish before standing again, the way he adjusted his pace to match hers, the way he never once assumed she would follow, but moved in a way that invited her to. It was subtle. It was consistent. It was everything Ethan had never practiced because he had never believed he needed to. A familiar voice approached again, someone more persistent this time, stepping into his space with the kind of confidence that assumed recognition would lead to engagement, and Ethan turned slightly, acknowledging them with a polite nod, his response measured, brief, enough to satisfy the expectation without extending the conversation. He had spent years mastering that balance, the ability to be present without being available, but now, for the first time, it felt hollow, like a skill that belonged to a version of himself that no longer fit the moment he was in. When the person moved on, their attention redirected elsewhere. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the center of the room, but his focus was no longer scattered. It was anchored. The realization settled deeper now, not sharp, not disruptive, but steady, like something that had always been true but had only just been named. He had built a life that rewarded distance, that valued control over connection, that allowed him to step away from anything that did not align with his expectations without consequence that he could see. But the consequences had existed. They had simply unfolded in places he had not looked. Lila's laughter carried again, light and unguarded, and it reached him in a way nothing else in the room did, not because it was loud, but because it was real, untouched by the layers of performance that filled the rest of the evening. He felt it settle into something inside him that had been closed for longer than he could measure, not opening fully, not yet, but shifting, enough to be noticed, enough to matter. He took a step to the side, not forward, not back, but repositioning, giving himself a clearer view without closing the distance. And in that movement, there was no urgency, no need to act, only the decision to remain aware, to remain present, to not turn away. Amara glanced up briefly, her eyes moving across the room in a quiet scan that took in everything at once. And when her gaze passed over him again, there was no change in her expression, no signal, no invitation, but there was no dismissal either. Just acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement, simple as it was, held more meaning now than anything she could have said earlier. It meant he was seen, not as he had been, not as he once expected to be, but as he was now, standing where he had placed himself. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment, letting that settle, letting it take shape without trying to define it too quickly, because he understood now that clarity did not come from forcing answers. It came from allowing truth to exist long enough to be understood. The music shifted again, a new song beginning, the rhythm slightly faster, drawing more people toward the floor, the energy of the room lifting in response. And Lila responded immediately, her body turning toward the sound, her earlier stillness gone, replaced by movement, by expression, by something that belonged entirely to her. Daniel followed without hesitation, his presence steady, his attention aligned, and Amara moved with them, not leading, not following, but existing within the same space with a balance that did not need to be explained. Ethan watched as they stepped back into the center, their movements blending into the larger rhythm of the room, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not feel pulled toward them. He felt grounded where he stood, because he understood now that moving closer would not change what had already been built. It would only disrupt what he was beginning to learn. A server passed again, offering another glass, and this time, Ethan accepted it, not out of habit, but with intention, holding it loosely as he continued to watch, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone beginning to understand where he stood in relation to what he saw. He did not raise the glass. He did not drink. He simply held it, a quiet anchor in a moment that no longer needed to be controlled. Across the room, Lila spun again, her movement freer now, her laughter brighter, and Daniel steadied her once more, his hand light, his presence constant, and Amara watched them with a quiet smile that did not seek attention, that did not perform, that simply existed because it was earned. Ethan felt something settle into place then, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that did not need to be questioned. He could not change what had been built. He could not step into it as if he had always been there. But he could choose what he did next. And for the first time, that choice was not about control. It was about intention. He lifted his gaze again, not searching, not reaching, but seeing, fully, clearly, without resistance. And as the music carried the room forward, he remained where he was, not because he was stuck, but because he was learning what it meant to move forward without forcing his way in. The rhythm of the room had fully settled now, no longer shifting between phases, no longer transitioning from one moment to another, but existing in a steady, lived-in flow that carried everyone forward without asking them to think about where they were going next. And within that movement, Ethan remained exactly where he had chosen to stand, no longer adjusting, no longer repositioning, simply present in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet increasingly necessary. The glass in his hand had grown warmer, untouched, a detail he barely registered as his attention remained anchored on the dance floor, where Amara, Daniel, and Lila moved within a space that no longer felt distant, but clearly defined, like something he could see without trying to reach. The music shifted again, a softer tempo returning, and the lights dimmed just slightly, casting a warmer tone across the room, softening the edges of everything, making the scene feel less like an event and more like a memory forming in real time. Couples drew closer, conversations quieted, and the movement on the floor slowed into something more intimate, more grounded, and Lila responded by stepping closer to Daniel, her earlier energy settling into a quieter rhythm, her small hand finding his again without hesitation. He adjusted immediately, his posture lowering just slightly, bringing himself closer to her level, his movements guided not by expectation, but by awareness, and Amara watched them with the same calm presence, her expression carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to be displayed to be understood. Ethan felt that certainty from where he stood, not as something directed at him, but as something that existed regardless of him, and it changed the way he saw everything in front of him. This was not a moment he had been excluded from. It was a life that had been built without his participation, and that distinction settled deeper now, no longer something he resisted, but something he accepted. A soft voice broke through his focus, closer this time, someone addressing him directly, and he turned slightly, his expression composed, his response measured, engaging just enough to acknowledge their presence without allowing the conversation to take hold. The exchange was brief, polite, forgettable, and when it ended, he returned his attention to the center of the room without hesitation, without distraction, because whatever existed there held more weight than anything else could offer him now. Amara stepped back from the dance floor again, her movement smooth, her attention shifting between Daniel and Lila with a quiet attentiveness that never overreached, and she guided Lila gently toward a nearby chair, her hand resting lightly against her shoulder as she spoke something soft, something grounding, something that brought a small nod from the child before she settled into the seat. Daniel followed, crouching slightly again, his voice low, his presence steady, ensuring that Lila remained comfortable, included, seen, and the simplicity of the interaction carried a depth that Ethan could not ignore. It was not grand. It was not dramatic. It was consistent. And consistency, he realized, was something he had never offered. He had offered moments, decisions, conclusions, but not presence, not continuity, not the kind of steady attention that built something over time rather than defining it in a single instance. The realization did not come as regret. It came as clarity, the kind that did not ask to be undone, but understood. Amara stood beside them for a moment longer, her gaze resting on Lila, her posture relaxed in a way that spoke of trust, and then she turned, her eyes moving across the room again, scanning, aware, and when they landed on Ethan, there was no hesitation, no avoidance, just a quiet acknowledgement that held steady for a second before she looked away again, her attention returning to the moment she had chosen. That look did not invite him. It did not dismiss him. It placed him exactly where he stood, visible, but separate, part of the room, but not part of the life unfolding within it. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, letting that settle without resistance, because for the first time, he was not trying to interpret it as something else. He was allowing it to be what it was. The music softened further, transitioning into something slower still, and a few couples remained on the floor, their movements unhurried, while others returned to their conversations, their laughter quieter now, their voices more personal. And the evening took on a tone that felt less public, more private, as if the room itself had exhaled and settled into something real. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not moving away, not stepping forward, but grounding himself in place, his presence steady, his attention clear, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to leave. Not because he belonged, but because leaving would be another form of avoidance, another version of the same choice he had made before. And that choice, he understood now, had already shaped more than he had been willing to see. Lila's voice carried softly again, calling for Amara this time, and Amara responded immediately, her movement fluid as she stepped back toward her, her hand reaching out instinctively, naturally, as if there had never been a moment where that connection did not exist. Daniel rose from his crouch, his attention shifting between them with the same steady awareness, and together, the three of them formed a small, complete circle that did not need anything beyond itself to remain whole. Ethan watched it without stepping closer, without interrupting, without inserting himself into something that did not belong to him. And in that restraint, there was no distance, no withdrawal, only understanding. Because he saw now that what stood in front of him was not something he could enter by presence alone. It was something that required time, consistency, and a kind of intention he had never practiced before. He lifted the glass slightly, not to drink, but to feel its weight, to anchor himself in something physical as everything else shifted into something less tangible. And as the music carried on and the room continued to move around him, he remained where he was, no longer outside by accident, but by choice, understanding that where he stood now was not the end of his position, but the beginning of what it would take to move beyond it. The night had settled into a quiet kind of permanence, the kind that did not announce itself, but simply existed, steady and complete, as the final notes of the music softened into the background and conversations thinned into smaller, more intimate exchanges. The energy that had once filled the room with anticipation had transformed into something calmer, something resolved, and within that stillness, Ethan remained where he stood, no longer searching for a place within the moment, but understanding the place he already held. The glass in his hand had gone untouched for so long that he finally lowered it onto a nearby table without looking, releasing it as easily as he had once held on to everything else too tightly. And for a brief second, his hands were empty, unoccupied, open in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet necessary. Across the room, Amara stood beside Lila, adjusting the small strap of her shoe with careful attention, her movements gentle, precise, her focus entirely on the child in front of her, and Daniel stood just behind them, not directing, not intervening, but present, his awareness filling the space in a way that did not need to be seen to be understood. It was a simple moment, one that would go unnoticed by most, but for Ethan, it carried more meaning than anything else that had happened that evening. Because it was not about the ceremony, not about the vows, not about the celebration. It was about continuity, about presence, about the quiet, consistent choices that built something real without needing recognition. Lila looked up at Amara with a small smile once the strap was secure, her hand reaching instinctively for hers, and Amara responded without hesitation, her fingers closing gently around the smaller hand, the connection immediate, natural, unquestioned. Daniel shifted slightly, his hand resting lightly at Lila's back as they began to move toward the exit, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the kind of calm transition that comes when a moment has reached its natural end. Guests began to follow in similar patterns, collecting coats, exchanging final words, laughter softening into farewells, and the room slowly began to empty, the echoes of the evening settling into memory rather than motion. Ethan watched as they moved, not from a distance that felt isolating, but from one that felt clear, defined, accepted. He did not step forward. He did not call out. He did not interrupt the quiet completeness of what he was witnessing, because for the first time, he understood that some moments were not meant to be altered. They were meant to be seen, and seeing them clearly was enough to change what came next. Amara paused briefly near the exit, her hand still holding Lila's, her posture steady as she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room one final time, and when it found Ethan, it held for a second longer than it had before. There was no question in it, no invitation, no hesitation, just recognition, not of who he had been, but of who he was choosing to be in that moment. Ethan met her gaze without shifting, without trying to reshape it, without reaching for something more than what it offered. And for the first time, there was no need to speak, because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed between them, not in words, but in actions, in choices, in the quiet truth that had unfolded throughout the night. Lila tugged gently at Amara's hand, her attention already turning toward the outside, toward the next moment waiting beyond the doors, and Daniel opened the exit with a smooth motion, stepping aside to allow them through, his presence steady, unchanged, unwavering. Amara gave a small nod, not as a gesture of closure, but as acknowledgement, and then she turned, stepping forward without looking back, her hand still in Lila's, her movement aligned with the life she had built, the direction she had chosen, the future that did not pause for anything left behind. The doors closed softly behind them, the sound barely audible over the fading music, but it carried a finality that settled into the room like the last note of a song. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, not frozen, not uncertain, but still, allowing the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had understood, everything he had accepted to settle fully before he moved. The room around him continued to empty, the lights dimming slightly, the staff beginning their quiet work of restoring order, clearing away the remnants of celebration, resetting the space for whatever would come next. But Ethan did not rush to leave. He did not step out immediately. He stood there, grounded in a moment that had already changed him in ways he could not yet fully define, but could no longer ignore. He inhaled slowly, the air steady, the weight in his chest no longer sharp, no longer pressing, but present in a way that felt purposeful rather than overwhelming. Then, finally, he turned, not toward the exit they had taken, not in pursuit, but toward his own path, one that had not existed when he walked into that room, but had been shaped by everything he had chosen to see instead of avoid. His steps were measured, not rushed, not hesitant, but intentional, each one carrying a clarity that had not been there before. He did not look back, not because he was closing the past, but because he understood now that looking forward required more than reflection. It required change, and as he stepped out into the night, the quiet air meeting him without resistance, There was no resolution waiting for him, no immediate answer, no certainty of what would come next. Only the understanding that what mattered was no longer what he had left behind. It was what he chose to build from this point on. And for the first time, that choice was not driven by control. It was driven by truth.